He had a body parts warehouse to hide human remains. The December wind cut through Detroit like a blade, carrying with it the bitter cold of a Michigan winter and something else entirely, the acrid smell of secrets about to be exposed. Federal agents stood outside an unremarkable warehouse in the suburbs, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air, as they prepared to execute a search warrant that would uncover one of the most disturbing discoveries in modern forensic history. The building looked innocent enough from the outside, just another industrial facility in a city that had seen better days, surrounded by the skeletal remains of Detroit's once mighty manufacturing empire. But behind those ordinary walls lay a chamber of horrors that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about the boundaries of human depravity. Arthur Rathburn had built his reputation as a legitimate businessman in the medical research field, a man who facilitated the donation of human bodies for scientific advancement. To his neighbors, he was just another entrepreneur trying to make an honest living in a struggling economy. To the medical community, he was a necessary middleman who helped connect donors with researchers who needed human tissue for their work. But to the federal agents who had been investigating him for months, he was something far more sinister. A man who had turned the noble practice of body donation into a grotesque business that treated human remains like commodities to be bought, sold, and stored without regard for dignity, safety, or the law. What they would find inside that warehouse would haunt seasoned investigators for years to come. Thousands of human body parts stored in conditions that defied both medical standards and basic human decency. Heads severed from bodies, limbs stacked like cordwood, torsos frozen together in macabre embraces that spoke of a complete disregard for the humanity these remains once possessed. The discovery would expose a network of corruption that reached into funeral homes, medical schools, and research facilities across the country, revealing how easily the trust placed in those who handle our most vulnerable moments can be betrayed. This wasn't just a story about one man's descent into moral bankruptcy. It was a window into an industry that operates in the shadows, where the line between legitimate science and ghoulish profiteering had been erased entirely. The origins. Arthur Rathburn didn't begin his career with the intention of becoming a merchant of human misery. Like many entrepreneurs, he started with what appeared to be a legitimate business idea in a field that served a genuine need. The medical research industry requires human tissue for everything from surgical training to disease research, and the demand far exceeds the supply of donated bodies. Rathburn saw an opportunity to fill that gap, positioning himself as a facilitator who could connect grieving families willing to donate their loved ones' remains with researchers who desperately needed them for the advancement of medical science. It was, on paper, a noble calling that served both the bereaved and the broader cause of human knowledge. In the early years of his operation, Rathburn appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a professional businessman operating in a specialized but legitimate field. He established relationships with funeral homes, medical schools, and research facilities, building a network that would eventually span multiple states. His company, International Biological Inc., presented itself as a scientific organization dedicated to advancing medical research through the ethical procurement and distribution of human tissue. The paperwork looked official, the credentials seemed legitimate, and the need for his services was undeniably real. To those who worked with him in those early days, he seemed like any other businessman trying to build a successful enterprise in a challenging but important field. But somewhere along the way, legitimate business practices gave way to something far more sinister. The exact moment when Rathburn crossed the line from ethical businessman to ghoulish profiteer is difficult to pinpoint, but the transformation was gradual and insidious. Perhaps it began with small corners cut to increase profits, minor violations of protocol that seemed harmless at the time. Maybe it started with the realization that human remains could be treated as inventory, bought and sold like any other commodity without regard for their former humanity. Whatever the catalyst, Rathburn's business model slowly evolved from serving science to serving only his own greed, setting the stage for the horrors that federal agents would eventually discover in his suburban warehouse. The first signs. The warning signs of Rathburn's descent into depravity were subtle at first, hidden beneath the veneer of professional competence that he had carefully cultivated over years of operation. Medical researchers who worked with International Biological Inc. began to notice irregularities in the documentation that accompanied tissue samples. Missing consent forms, vague descriptions of the donors' medical histories, and paperwork that seemed hastily prepared or deliberately obscured. But in an industry where demand far exceeded supply, these red flags were often overlooked or rationalized away by researchers desperate for the materials they needed to advance their work. Funeral directors who had partnered with Rathburn's company started to report concerns about the speed with which bodies were being processed and the lack of detailed information about where the remains were ultimately being sent. Some noted that families who had agreed to donate their loved ones' bodies for medical research were asking questions about the specific uses their donations would serve, questions that Rathburn seemed increasingly reluctant or unable to answer. The normal protocols for tracking donated bodies through the research process appeared to be breaking down, replaced by a system that prioritized volume and profit over transparency and accountability. Perhaps most troubling were the reports from medical facilities that had received tissue samples from International Biological Inc. that appeared to be contaminated or improperly preserved. Some researchers reported receiving specimens that showed signs of disease or infection that hadn't been disclosed in the accompanying documentation. Others noted that the condition of the tissue suggested it had been stored for extended periods under substandard conditions, raising questions about both the safety and the scientific value of the materials they were receiving. These concerns were often reported to regulatory agencies, but the complex web of jurisdictions and the relatively unregulated nature of the body donation industry made effective oversight difficult. The first signs were there for those who knew how to look, but the full scope of Rathburn's operation remained hidden behind the legitimate facade of scientific research. It would take a federal investigation to reveal the true extent of the horrors taking place in that suburban Detroit warehouse where human dignity was being sacrificed on the altar of profit, and the sacred trust placed in those who handle our mortal remains was being violated in ways that defied comprehension. The escalation. As Rathburn's operation grew in scope and scale, so did his willingness to abandon even the pretense of ethical behavior. What had begun as minor violations of protocol escalated into a systematic disregard for every standard that governed the handling of human remains. The warehouse that served as his primary storage facility became a grotesque monument to his complete abandonment of human decency, where bodies and body parts were treated with less care than most people would show to livestock. The refrigeration systems that were supposed to preserve the integrity of donated tissue were allowed to fail repeatedly, creating conditions that would have been unacceptable in any legitimate medical facility. The escalation wasn't just about poor storage conditions. It was about a fundamental shift in how Rathburn viewed the human remains under his care. Bodies that had been donated by grieving families who believed they were contributing to medical science were being dismembered and distributed without regard for the donor's wishes or the recipient's actual needs. Heads were severed from bodies and sold separately, limbs were removed and packaged like cuts of meat, and torsos were carved up and distributed to multiple buyers without any consideration for the dignity of the person who had once inhabited that flesh. Perhaps most disturbing was the evidence that Rathburn had begun accepting bodies from sources that were questionable at best and potentially criminal at worst. The documentation that accompanied many of the remains in his warehouse was either missing entirely or so poorly maintained that it was impossible to verify the legitimacy of the donations. Some bodies appeared to have been acquired from funeral homes that were cutting corners on cremation costs by selling bodies that were supposed to be cremated to Rathburn instead. Others seemed to come from sources that couldn't or wouldn't provide proper documentation about the cause of death or the donor's medical history. The escalation reached its peak when investigators later discovered that Rathburn had been knowingly distributing tissue from donors who had died from infectious diseases, including HIV and hepatitis, without properly disclosing these conditions to the researchers who received the materials. This wasn't just a violation of industry standards, it was a potential public health crisis that put countless medical professionals and researchers at risk of exposure to deadly diseases. The man who had once positioned himself as a facilitator of medical advancement had become a threat to the very community he claimed to serve. The crime. The full scope of Arthur Rathburn's crimes became apparent on that frigid December day in 2013 when federal agents finally gained access to his warehouse of horrors. What they discovered inside defied every expectation and challenged every assumption about the limits of human callousness. The facility that was supposed to be a legitimate medical research operation was revealed to be something far more sinister. A charnel house where human remains were stored, processed and distributed with less care than most people would show to garbage. The scene that greeted investigators was one of systematic desecration that spoke to a complete abandonment of human dignity. Thousands of body parts were stacked in freezers and storage areas throughout the facility, many without proper identification or documentation. Heads were stored separately from bodies, creating a macabre inventory of human features that had been reduced to mere commodities. Limbs were bundled together and labeled like cuts of meat, while torsos were carved up and distributed among multiple containers without any regard. But the physical horror of the scene was only part of the crime. The real violation was the systematic betrayal of trust that Rathburn's operation represented. Families who had made the difficult decision to donate their loved ones' bodies for medical research had been lied to and exploited. Their grief had been turned into profit, and their loved ones' remains had been treated with a callousness that bordered on the criminal. Medical researchers who had trusted Rathburn to provide them with ethically sourced tissue had been unknowingly participating in a system that violated every principle of scientific integrity. The crime wasn't just about the mishandling of human remains. It was about the corruption of institutions and relationships that form the foundation of civilized society. The impact. The discovery of Rathburn's warehouse of horrors sent shockwaves through multiple communities, each grappling with the implications of what had been uncovered in that suburban Detroit facility. The medical research community found itself confronting the uncomfortable reality that their demand for human tissue had created a market that could be exploited by unscrupulous operators like Rathburn. Universities, hospitals, and research institutions that had purchased materials from International Biological Inc. were forced to review their procurement practices and question whether they had unknowingly participated in the desecration of human remains. For the families who had donated their loved ones' bodies to what they believed was legitimate medical research, the revelation was devastating. Many had made the difficult decision to forego traditional burial or cremation in the belief that their loved ones' remains would contribute to scientific advancement and the betterment of humanity. Instead, they learned that their family members had been treated like inventory in a grotesque business operation that showed no respect for human dignity or the sacred trust placed in those who handle the dead. The psychological trauma of this betrayal was compounded by the uncertainty about what had actually happened to their loved ones' remains and whether they would ever be recovered and properly laid to rest. The broader community was forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the regulation and oversight of industries that operate largely out of public view. The body donation industry, which had previously received little attention from regulators or the media, suddenly found itself under intense scrutiny. Questions were raised about how such an operation could continue for years without detection, and what safeguards existed to prevent similar abuses in the future. The case highlighted the vulnerability of grieving families and the potential for exploitation in industries that deal with death and human remains. Perhaps most troubling was the realization that Rathburn's operation was likely not unique. The discovery in Detroit prompted investigations in other states and revealed a pattern of poor oversight and inadequate regulation that suggested similar abuses might be occurring elsewhere. The impact extended beyond the immediate victims to challenge the entire system of body donation and medical research, forcing a reckoning with practices that had been taken for granted for decades. When stories like this come to light, it's crucial that we share them and discuss them, ensuring that the lessons learned lead to meaningful reforms that protect both the dignity of the dead and the integrity of scientific research. The investigation. The federal investigation into Arthur Rathburn's operation was a complex undertaking that required coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The initial raid on the warehouse was just the beginning of a process that would ultimately involve the FBI, the Food and Drug Administration, state health departments, and local law enforcement agencies across multiple states. The scope of the investigation was unprecedented, requiring forensic experts to catalog and identify thousands of human remains, while simultaneously tracing the network of suppliers and customers that had enabled Rathburn's operation to flourish for years. The forensic work alone was staggering in its complexity and disturbing in its details. Each body part had to be catalogued, photographed, and tested for infectious diseases, a process that took months to complete and required investigators to work in hazardous conditions. Many of the remains were so poorly preserved or inadequately labeled that identification was impossible, leaving investigators with the grim task of trying to match anonymous body parts with missing persons reports and donation records. The discovery that many of the remains tested positive for HIV, hepatitis, and other infectious diseases added another layer of urgency to the investigation, as authorities scrambled to identify and notify researchers who might have been exposed to contaminated tissue. The paper trail that investigators followed revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond Rathburn's warehouse. Funeral homes that were supposed to be cremating bodies were instead selling them to Rathburn for profit. Medical schools and research institutions that should have been verifying the legitimacy of their tissue sources had failed to ask the hard questions that might have exposed the operation years earlier. The investigation revealed a system of willful blindness and institutional negligence that had allowed Rathburn to operate with impunity for years. Perhaps most disturbing were the financial records that showed the true scope of Rathburn's profiteering. Bodies that families had donated for free were being sold for thousands of dollars, with individual body parts commanding premium prices based on their condition and rarity. The investigation revealed that Rathburn had generated millions of dollars in revenue from his ghoulish business, treating human remains as nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold for maximum profit. The evidence painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had turned grief into greed and scientific advancement into a cover for criminal enterprise. The judgment. The legal proceedings against Arthur Rathburn unfolded in a federal courtroom where the full scope of his crimes was laid bare for public scrutiny. The charges against him were extensive and serious: fraud, conspiracy, and the illegal transportation of hazardous materials, among others. But the legal framework struggled to adequately address the moral dimensions of what Rathburn had done. How do you quantify the violation of trust that occurs when someone's loved one is treated like a piece of merchandise? How do you calculate damages for the desecration of human remains and the betrayal of families' most sacred wishes? The prosecution's case was built on a mountain of evidence that documented years of systematic abuse and exploitation. Federal prosecutors presented testimony from investigators who had witnessed the horrors of the warehouse, first-hand medical experts who explained the health risks created by Rathburn's practices, and family members who described the devastating impact of learning that their loved ones had been treated with such callous disregard. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, painting a picture of a man who had systematically exploited the grief of others for his own financial gain. Rathburn's defense team faced an almost impossible task in trying to mitigate the impact of the evidence against their client. They argued that he had been operating in a poorly regulated industry where standards were unclear and oversight was minimal. They suggested that his intentions had been legitimate, even if his execution had been flawed. But these arguments rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence of deliberate wrongdoing and the systematic nature of the violations that had been uncovered. The judgment, when it finally came, reflected both the seriousness of Rathburn's crimes and the limitations of the legal system in addressing such unprecedented violations. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison and ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution. But for many of the families affected by his crimes, no legal judgment could adequately address the harm that had been done. The sentence was seen as a step toward justice, but it could never undo the violation of trust and dignity that had occurred in that suburban Detroit warehouse. The case set important precedents for the prosecution of similar crimes and led to significant reforms in the regulation of the body donation industry. But it also highlighted the ongoing vulnerability of grieving families to exploitation by those who would profit from their pain. The criminal mind. Understanding the psychology of Arthur Rathburn requires an examination of how someone can systematically dehumanize others to such an extent that human remains become nothing more than inventory to be processed and sold. Rathburn's transformation from legitimate businessman to ghoulish profiteer did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process of moral compromise that ultimately led to a complete abandonment of human empathy and decency. The evidence suggests that his crimes were driven not by mental illness or psychological compulsion, but by simple greed and a willingness to exploit others' vulnerability for personal gain. What makes Rathburn's case particularly disturbing is the calculated nature of his crimes. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a systematic operation that required planning, organization, and a deliberate decision to prioritize profit over human dignity. The evidence shows that he was fully aware of the health risks he was creating by distributing contaminated tissue, yet he continued to do so because it was profitable. He knew that families trusted him to treat their loved ones' remains with respect, yet he systematically violated that trust because it served his financial interests. The criminal mind at work here was one that had learned to compartmentalize human suffering and to view other people's grief as an opportunity for exploitation. Rathburn had developed the ability to interact with grieving families and present himself as a caring professional while simultaneously treating their loved ones' remains with shocking callousness. This kind of psychological compartmentalization is often seen in white-collar criminals who are able to maintain a facade of respectability while engaging in systematic wrongdoing. Perhaps most troubling is the evidence that Rathburn had convinced himself that his actions were somehow justified or even beneficial. Like many criminals who exploit vulnerable populations, he appears to have developed a